Alla Miran, grazie Eminenza, Eccellenze, tutti che siete venuti in questo numero, siamo davvero sorpresi, vi diamo ancora un benvenuto all'inizio di questa parte quando andiamo ad profundum. Vi auguro che con questa prima relazione, che forse non sarà così teologica nel sua essenza, possiamo capire un po' di più del contesto in cui ci troviamo. Parlerò in inglese, però spero che potrete seguirmi. One of the possible sources of contextual theology is the exploration of history in a particular geographical area. If you look at the area of the present-day settlement of Slovenians, we are talking about the area of the northern Adriatic between eastern Alpine and the Danube area. In the terminology of the early imperial period, this would be the area between the Roman provinces, Italia and Illyricum. In this relatively narrow area, in the 3rd and 4th century, we witness the beginnings of the interpretation of the Bible in the Latin writings. And in this cultural area that is stretched between the dense cities of Betovia at one side and Aquileia on the other side, can rightly be called the cradle of the Latin Patristic Exegesis. In the following, I will try to briefly present in chronological orders three of the most important and interesting figures that can be an inspiration even for us today. So first, Victorinus of Poetovio. Victorinus, Bishop of Poetovio, is considered the first Latin biblical exegete. At the same time, he also represents the earliest historically attested beginnings of the Christian presence in the present-day Slovenian territory. One of the reasons for choosing this, my topic tonight, was the quotation by two illustrious Italian scholars, Claudio Moreschini and Enrico Norelli, who wrote in a recent updated edition of their book Storia della letteratura cristiana greca e latina that Victorinus was bishop al margine settentrionale dell'impero, in Poetovio, una oscura località di frontiera del Norico, attuale Austria. Ecco, cominciamo qui. If not contemptuous, these statements at least show a lack of knowledge, which in this case is not so rare in broad scholarly literature. Poetovio, the oldest recorded city in Slovenia, was in fact an important Roman city, since it is located at a strategically important crossing of the river Danube along the prehistoric trade route between the Baltic Sea and the Adriatic, along the main transport link between Italy as the center of the empire and the central Danube region, which was the way to the center of the eastern part of the empire. The city developed a strong economical and cosmopolitan character. Victorinus was a Christian intellectual and a writer who knew Greek and even better than Latin, as Jerome reports. He was a bishop in this important city in the second half of the 3rd century. He died around year 303 or 4 as a martyr under Diocletian's persecution. Jerome mentions his exegetical forerunner, Victorinus, many times as Noster. So Jerome held his as Victorinus Noster because of his sanctity, because of his enormous literary corpus, and perhaps because of his geographical vicinity of their homelands. In his work, Jerome, on Illustrious Men, Jerome writes, Victorinus, Bishop of Poetovio, who was not equally familiar with Latin and Greek, on this account his works, though noble in thought, are inferior in style. There are the following: commentaries on Genesis, on Exodus, on Leviticus, on Isaiah, on Ezekiel, on Habakkuk, on Ecclesiastes, on the Song of Songs, on the Apocalypse of John, against all heresies, and many others. And the last, he received the crown of martyrdom. So Jerome reports a whole list of different works, and only 10% of these works today still exist. We know only Victorinus's commentary on the Apocalypse and few other short texts. He was very much influenced by Origen's way of exegesis, but he was well aware of also Asiatic theological tradition. Today, the Institute for Patristic Studies at the Faculty of Theology at the University of Ljubljana is named after Victorinus, Victorinianum, A large bronze statue in Ptui commemorates him. Studies of his works are still being produced, and since 1999, Victorinus also speaks Slovenian, thanks to our professor of patrology that's sitting at the end of this aula and will speak later tonight. Victorinus has recently become even more deeply embedded in Slovenian national consciousness, as a Slovenian priest and writer, Branko Cestnik, dedicated to him his novel, The Sixth Seal, Šesti pečat, which was widely acclaimed by readers. The second person I want to present tonight has as well a Latin name. This one as well is a very positive name. His name was Fortunatianus of Aquileia. In 2012, Lucas Dorfbauer, an Austrian scholar, discovered the work Commentarii in Evangelia, and based on some linguistic characteristics and concordance with the three fragments already known, ascribed it to the Fortunatianus of Aquileia, an African bishop of this important North Italian Roman city in the middle of the 4th century. In the 9th century codex from Köln, he identified a commentary on the Gospels, which has been lying in oblivion for around 1500 years, so 1,500 years, but proof at the end to be probably the oldest existent Latin Gospel commentary. It can be dated roughly to the years around 350. The only other competitor for this title is Hilary of Poitiers, who wrote his Commentarium in Mattheum somewhere between 353-56. Scarce biographical information about Fortunatianus known to us before the discovery of the text relied mainly on a brief remark in Jerome's work, De Viris Illustribus. I cite, Fortunatianus composed brief commentaries on the Gospels written in a rustic style and is held in detestation because when Liberius, Bishop of Rome, was driven into exile for the faith, he was induced by the urgency of Fortunatianus to subscribe to heresy. So again, we see that Jerome had problems with the people who were also great. He had to criticize them at least a bit. Jerome offers here a rather negative appraisal of Fortunatianus' work from linguistic and stylistic perspective, rustico sermone, but even more damning is his remark, detestabilis, on his doctrinal failure, because he accused him that he forced Liberius, Pope of Rome, to support some kind of semi-Arian symbol of faith. If the text was discovered in 2012, then we had to wait 5 years until 2017, when the Latin critical edition appeared, at the same year together with the English translation. So now we can reaffirm his doctrinal position, and as far as recent studies have proven, he was far more orthodox or Catholic or Nicene in his thought than Jerome held him to be. Only 4 years after the apparition of the critical edition, in 2021, the Slovenian translation, Razlage Evangelio, was published as a second translation into a modern language, the only one so far after English. Fortunatianus' work was probably written as a kind of a manual for the interpretation of gospel passages, written by him as a bishop for his priests to use it as a tool. And we can rightfully assume that maybe in the 4th century Emona, present-day Ljubljana, the capital, the Catholic priests maybe read it or use it as a tool for the exegesis. So we are somehow related to Fortunatianus' work as well. Let me conclude with the third character, which is probably the most known. His name was Hieronymus of Stridon. Certainly the greatest figure in all history who came from this region is Saint Jerome. Around 345, as he himself reports, he was born in the city of Strido, which is on the border of Dalmatia and Pannonia. Opidos Stridonis, Dalmatiae condam Pannoniaeque confinum. The Gordian knot of Stridon's ubication has not been untangled for centuries, and I have no pretensions to untangle it tonight. Researchers classified 5 hypotheses: the Pannonian, the Dalmatian, the Istrian, the Liburnian, and the Karstic hypothesis. The last 2 are somehow the most relevant today. Jerome's birthplace would thus lie somewhere between the late antique Aquileia, Emona, and Tersatica in Croatia. This sometimes still causes inter-neighbor disputes, especially with Croats, who also want to have their share in the ubication of Jerome's Stridon. Nevertheless, in Jerome's 7th letter, he himself states, "In mea enim patria rusticitatus vernacula, Deus venter est, et de die vivitur, sanctior est ille quid ditior est." My country is enslaved to rustic behavior. Their God is their belly, and the richer you are, the more saintly you are held to be. Perhaps this Jerome's eloquent and precise description fits like a glove both Slovenian and Croatian milieu. Therefore, there is no need to exclude anybody. Anyhow, Jerome's contribution to the history of exegesis is not to be dwelt upon. We can only situate him now, for the purpose of this talk, in the geographical and cultural context from which he emerged. And I try to come to conclusion. In his commentary on the prophet Zephaniah, Jerome wrote of God's wrath on areas. I quote, "Witness Illyricum, witness Thrace, witness the land in which I was born, where everything is destroyed except the sun and the earth, the growing thorns and the thick forests." Unquote. I hope that today he could write something more favorable about his homeland. In addition to the search of his birthplace, many ancient churches in what is now Slovenia are also dedicated to St. Jerome. In 2019, we organized the largest ever Congress of Hieronymian Studies in Ljubljana, attended by more than 130 scholars from all over the world. On this occasion, a street in Ljubljana, in the area of the former Roman town of Emona, when he wrote 2 letters to, was named after him. In 2021, 20 translators, many of them are among us tonight, translated the entire corpus of his epistolae into Slovenian. And for almost a decade, a well-attended Latin Mass in honor of St. Jerome has been held every year on 30 September at Emona's early Christian baptistery. After all, Jerome is not considered only a titan in the field of biblical studies, but his work, De Viris Illustribus, also established him in the history of literature as the first ever patrologian. This fact encourages us and gives us the responsibility to foster interest in early Christianity and the Church Fathers. And now I come to my final thoughts. I'd like to emphasize the important role of patristics in the modern history of Slovenian theology. Probably the oldest patristic translation into Slovenian, which was never published, unfortunately, and whose manuscript translation has been lost, is Augustine's Enchiridion from the year 1781. The first translator of patristic texts into Slovenian that have survived, even if only in manuscript, was a Franciscan, Father Klemen Velikonia, who at the end of the 18th century produced translation of longer passages from the works of various church fathers. Only in 1932, the first translation of the entire patristic work, Augustine's Confessiones, was published. In the 30s of the past century, the eminent philologist and theologian Franz Xaver Luckmann gathered around him a team of well-educated scholars, and an agreement was signed with the Slovenian Theological Academy for a translation project of no less than 50 patristic works. The first volume in the series, The Writings of St. Cyprian, appeared in 1938, and by 1943, when the circumstances of the Second World War sadly interrupted the project, 6 more volumes had been published. To put this in a context, the prestigious French collection of patristic translations, Sources Chrétiens, was founded only 4 years later, in 1942. Unfortunately, they are now at number, I think, 628, and it is only since the 1990s, after the democratic changes, that a little patristic renaissance has been taking place in Slovenia, trying to make up for decades of delay. trying to struggle against the patria rusticitatis vernacula in a country where once was a cradle of the Latin patristic exegesis. Grazie per la vostra attenzione.